It's almost Halloween, and you may have noticed some strange nocturnal creatures appearing in front yards around your neighborhood. The sun is setting later, and it's warming up as we come into spring. And on long, warm evenings, you might also notice little dark shapes flitting about in the sky. My guest today is an AWC ecologist and bat researcher whose work has taken him around the world, from the cloud forests of Costa Rica to the jungles of Borneo. And now he's embarking on a PhD looking at bats in the Australian arid zone. So a big spooky welcome to Oli Aylen, speaking to us from Brisbane. Thanks for joining us, Oli.
Hi, Joe.
Oli, how did you first get into bats?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot. I think originally I saw a colony of 1.5 million free-tailed bats leave a cave in Thailand when I was traveling in sort of my early 20s. And then went to university and actually found out that New Zealand does in fact have bats. A lot of Kiwis don't even know that. So there are two species. And it just fascinated me that they're New Zealand's only terrestrial mammal. And yeah, just started to do all my assignments on them. Quite quickly got the nickname Batman. It just sort of spiraled from there, really. Yeah, they're just fascinating creatures.
They are fascinating, and they're, I think some of our most underappreciated native animals. They have a reputation as bloodsuckers, which is not really fair, is it? There's hardly any of them want to suck up blood.
Yeah, very few. So there's three species of true vampire bats found in sort of Central America. So they do feed on blood, but they're actually very, very cool, very unique. But yeah, most of them. So there's over 1,400 species globally. So just three of those you might have to watch out for. But they generally go for cows, not people. So
okay, so a mostly undeserved reputation as bloodsuckers. Right. In Australia, I guess the bats that most of us would be familiar with are the large flying foxes or fruit bats, which are more likely to be found sucking on a mango than coming for your jugular. Do you get flying foxes where you are in Brisbane?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So all three species up here, the three species down here, and then the spectacled further north. Yeah, so the blacks live literally just outside. I actually live in an apartment, but there's lots around as we walk the dog. Yeah, and the flying foxes, a lot of people actually ask me, like, are flying foxes bats? Of course they are. They're just in a slightly different group. And yeah, the sort of fruit bats is an interesting name. They do eat fruit, but actually they're really nectar bats. Right. That's what they're after, the blossom, which is why they're really important for pollination. But yeah, amazing animals, and actually a big reason for me moving to Australia. Having them flying around the cities is just awesome.
I don't think we get enough immigration, inspired by our bat diversity, but it's great that you chose Australia to further your studies in these incredible creatures. So we do see bats in urban landscapes. I'm here in Sydney, and there's, big camps of fruit bats in some of the parks and even the Botanic Gardens, just, right in the city. But sometimes they clash with people, don't they? There's conflict when bats come into those human-dominated landscapes.
Yeah, they do. They're kind of the poster child for human wildlife conflict, really, I guess, especially in Australia. For crops, that they will come in and eat crop growers' fruits. And often they are allowed to shoot them, although this is being phased out now in most states. But yeah, and they're sort of, they congregate in these remaining vegetated areas, which are generally our parks or our waterfronts. But that's really because that's the habitat they have left. We have cleared a huge amount of the Australian bush, so it's really just an effect of that. They get pushed into these areas. Interestingly, I recently went to the National Flying Fox Forum, and we're actually seeing issues in Brisbane, in the Moreton Bay area, of ibis and flying foxes both being pushed into areas, and now we have issues of the bats and the ibis actually eating bat pups.
Oh wow.
Just this terrible noise as well with the ibis and the flying foxes. So it's sort of this issue of these two perhaps not overly well loved species being essentially pushed into these similar areas.
Who do we barrack for in bin chickens versus fruit bats? That's a very difficult question.
Well, it's funny, actually, one of my team members studied the Australian white ibis for his honours, so we were debating that one.
Very interesting. I hadn't heard of that before. So they are familiar species, these flying foxes, but as you mentioned, some of them are threatened, not just through human-wildlife conflict. What are the other threats facing bats in Australia?
Yeah, so I mean, it all really comes down to habitat clearing. They lose their habitat, and then it's the impact of these other factors acting in unison that create the issues. So we're seeing, of course, these massive heat stress events, and this is a significant issue for the grey-headed and the blacks. The reds are more sort of tropical species; they tend to deal with the heat a bit more. But during these heat stress events where temperatures are getting above, the early 40 degrees, thousands of bats will die and just fall out of trees.
Mm.
I'm reasonably involved with Bat Conservation Rescue Queensland, and we're all getting ready for what is, probably going to be a pretty bad year for that. But because that habitat's being cleared, it reduces where they can go. And the Adelaide Botanic Gardens is a good example of this. So the grey-headed flying foxes have actually sort of moved themselves over towards Adelaide because they've run out of these patches. And these factors get compounded by the fact that bats only have one pup a year. So when they have these big population drops, they just can't recover that quickly. Often they won't start breeding until they're 3-4 years old. So it's just a very slow recovery that they get hampered by.
Interesting. I think for many of us, we see bats, but we probably don't consider, their breeding, their life cycle, all of these aspects of their life. And they're quite, doting parents as well, aren't they?
They are, yeah. So they'll look after young for sort of up to 12 weeks. And yeah, highly social, very intelligent. So their brain to body ratio, which is often used as a sort of level of intelligence, is similar to a domestic dog. They can remember things for years. They sort of map the country. They know where to go. They will follow these tracks out to areas. And in fact, the grey-headed, they are endangered. They're still at very high numbers. Obviously, people see them all over the place. But yeah, it's amazing how far they will go, and using actually weather satellites. So they do this for magpie geese as well. They can actually track them, particularly down in sort of Victoria and southern New South Wales. So there's been some really cool research showing just how far they travel. They're very nomadic species, following the available fruit and nectar.
There's a special species of fruit bat in North Queensland that I've got a photo of that I think you took. Can you tell us about this one?
Yeah, awesome. So this is Dobsonia magna. So not a true flying fox. So it's in its own genus, not the Pteropus. And this is actually a species that lives in Papua New Guinea as well. So we're very lucky to just have it up in the tip of Cape York, like many of our other species. But that's also called, the barebacked fruit bat, as you can see there. And they're amazing. They have these little pouches in their wings, which they're not entirely sure why, but they think it's maybe to help them. They can almost hover, and you hear them coming. So you can hear this as they come down, and they'll come in and get fruit. So when we were up doing surveys, I remember the team leader saying, don't keep fruit in your bag. And someone had a banana, and this big bat came flying over. So that was taken, I think, in Iron Range, but we recently saw a few up at Picanini when I was there in August as well. So great that they're hanging around.
So interesting. So from one of the larger species to, I guess the great diversity of bats are much smaller than the flying foxes that we see around. Mm-hmm. I've got another photo here of one of the micro bats, as they're called, and these are bats that use echolocation primarily to navigate the world. Tell us about the great diversity of microbats in Australia that make up most of the 83 species.
Yeah, as you said, so most people, when they hear of bats, they think of these flying foxes. They're the ones that are commonly seen. But the majority of bats, I think about 76 of those 83, are these small echolocating bats, and generally weighing about 5 to 10 grams. Very small, very diverse. So of all the total species, about 1,000 of those 1,400 are what are traditionally called microbats. And they use echolocation to forage. So they're not blind. They actually have reasonably okay vision, but they use echolocation to find their prey using a few different techniques. That species there was Nyctophilus jeffreyi, so the lesser long-eared bat, and that's actually thought to be Australia's most abundant mammal. So you can pretty much find that anywhere in Australia.
Now, there's lots of different sorts of microbats as well. Can you describe in a bit more detail that echolocation system that they've come up with? We think of bats as blind or having really poor vision, but actually they can build a complex model of the world around them using sound. How does that system work?
Yeah, so they've really diversified, finding this unique niche, being nocturnal. But of course, yeah, then adapted this technique. So they will let out these sort of regular pulses, which is what's called their search phase. And this gives them an idea of what's happening in the environment. And they have different shapes of these calls. So some species that I work with in Borneo have these amazingly high frequency calls that give them this insane detail. But they're letting out these search phase calls, and then as they detect a prey item, so this is for the bats that use this typical sort of pursuit strategy, they'll then speed up the repetition of their calls, which gives them much greater detail, and then they actually scoop them up. So in between their back legs, they have a tail in between, and they use this almost like a net, and they scoop up the insect and then actually eat it on the wing. But other bats, I think you've got a photo there, Joe, the Rhinolophus, which is what's considered one of the more old world fruit bats, the Megaphilus with the big nose. Yeah. They actually use a constant frequency. So rather than calling, so the ones I was talking about before are sort of from 80 kilohertz down to about sort of 40. We can hear up to about 20. These Rhinolophus species, so these old world bats, you can see this elaborate, what's called a nose leaf there. They let out just a single frequency. So this guy is about 70 kilohertz. And then they compensate for Doppler shift, which is that sound. So when you hear a motorbike like a going past, they compensate for that. And they use more of a sit and wait strategy. So probably what I'd use if I was a bat. They sit and wait, just hanging out. They use these big ears to let out this single frequency, wait for a prey item to go past, and that's when they then snatch them. So yes, slightly different techniques. And what's interesting with that Rhinolophus, if we just go back to the Nyctophilus, is that the Nyctophilus are kind of like the Australian version. So they will use nasal echolocation. And they again have this sort of nose structure. That's one way you can tell the species. Take that out of their nose. So this is another one that I caught up north. And again have these very big ears, so you can sort of see the similarities. Obviously they're totally different genus and they're in a different suborder, but yeah, really cool that these guys have sort of evolved a similar way of doing so. The issue that we have with these Nyctophilus bats when we're using these guys are so cute. This is caught up at Buller River and Pungalina, so they're only about 5 grams. Yeah, is that they all let out a very almost identical call. So when you have Nyctophilus in the area, which of course with the lesser long ears, they're pretty much everywhere, you can't actually tell the species just using this call structure alone.
So they've got different systems for echolocation, and that sort of matches their different lifestyles. You mentioned some of them roost in forests, so in hollow trees or under loose bark, others that roost in caves. But they also hunt different foods as well. So there are some species that hunt spiders, some that hunt insects on the wing. Talk about some of those different lifestyles.
Yeah, so one, of course, anyone that followed the Australian Mammal of the Year is the golden tip bats, which are just amazing. I've only caught one in Australia, but I caught its cousin in Borneo. So just this, they look like someone's flicked gold paint on them, and they're really cool. They'll roost underneath disused bird nests. And they have the highest echolocation call of bats in Australia, which gives them this really fine detail to the point where they will get spiders off the web, and they actually know which side of the web the spider is on, obviously so they don't get caught in it. So just phenomenal. And then of course on the other end of the spectrum, we're getting into the ghost bat. So just an iconic species for Australia. So these guys are about 100 grams, so much bigger. And they're actually a carnivorous bat. So there's only a couple in Australia that will actually predate on other bats, but also sleeping birds, reptiles. They've been, I think you were telling me just before, Joe, you're reading about a paper where they seek out budgies sleeping on trees. So pretty amazing. So then they're also nicknamed the false vampire bat. So they do look kind of similar to vampire bats, and they have that sort of reputation. But just phenomenal. But unfortunately, they have been a real victim to mining. So most of our threatened species in Australia are the cave roosting bats. So the bats that require caves, and just through the activities of mining, they've largely lost these areas. They're also very sensitive to just human disturbance in general. And they have a a roosting cave, but they'll also have a feeding cave. So they'll go and find a sleeping bird, and then take it back to their feeding cave, which is, yeah, pretty cool.
That's very Halloween stuff of nightmares.
It is.
And apparently they have sharp teeth, strong jaws. So they really are predators on wings. Something to think about next time you're camping out in Northern Australia.
Well, if you see one, tell someone, because they're declining.
Yeah, yeah. Now, just coming back to the pollen and blossom eaters, the fruit bats and flying foxes. So, we've heard about how insectivorous bats eat a big range of different foods, and they're obviously part of food webs and ecosystems and have important roles to play. But, the fruit bats are also pollinating and dispersing seeds, aren't they? And we've learned a little bit more about their movements, especially, an example you told me in North Queensland.
Yeah, so I was at the Flying Fox Forum and speaking to a researcher from CSIRO, and yeah, so they were using GPS trackers. So this is really just, I think, going to just blow our mind with where bats go and how often. So they tracked a spectacled flying fox from Port Douglas, and every single night, this female was flying to Brooklyn, so AWC's Brooklyn property, just outside of Cairns, onto this ephemeral creek line where these melaleucas were in flower, and she was doing this every night. So about 130-kilometer round trip each night to her favorite feeding spot. So really cool. And I think we're going to learn more about microbats as well, about how far they travel. But you can imagine that range, if all of these species are doing this, or all these individuals, the importance of that pollination for gene dispersal. And of course, going back to the seed dispersal, with the fires that we've experienced and a lot of vegetation being lost, many of these trees only re-establish through flying foxes. So compared to birds, flying foxes can eat larger seeds, take more in, and also travel much larger distances. So they really are vital for the Australian ecosystem to re-veg these forests, to pollinate the trees. Yes, they can be noisy. Yes, they can be a bit smelly, although I didn't say that. But they're so important, and they're so clever. They're just fascinating. So
I guess the really scary part of this story is that many species are threatened, and for lots of them, we don't actually have a good picture of how they're going. There are big knowledge gaps. You've been studying bats around the world, but how do you begin to understand these tiny mammals flying through the air in the dark? They're so small you can't, they weigh just a few grams. They call mostly at a frequency that we can't hear, so we can't see them, we can't hear them for the most part. How do you even begin to study bats?
Yeah, so I guess the first way that I was exposed to it, so we use what's called harp traps. So if you imagine the musical instrument, a harp, with all of its strings, but in a more rectangular shape, and then we just use fishing wire. And you elevate these in what we consider to be flyways. So in the forest, literally walkways, they will use these sort of roads each night to get around the forest. And they're busy feeding, they're not really paying attention. And, there wasn't a harp trap in their way yesterday. So they hit the strings and they fall into a bag. And then we can come and check the bag a couple of hours later, and we're able to ID them. And this gives us an idea of what's around. But it will only catch a certain arrangement of a community of species. So these generally smaller, more clutter bats, which like this sort of dense forest. For ones that fly a bit higher, so in the arid zone, I've been doing this. We use mist nets. So anyone that's familiar with trapping birds, it's basically the same. And you'll get bats that are a bit higher. You can put them on poles or suspend them from trees in ropes. But as you can imagine, it takes a lot of time, and then you're only really catching the bats that are in that specific area, and you tend to target areas where you think you get more bats around waterways, etc. So since the discovery of echolocations, that was actually back in the 1940s, and then through the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, it was really electrical engineers that were your bat specialists, because they were the only people that knew how to make, or wanted to make, I guess, bat detectors. But really over the last 10 years, this has just exploded. The whole use of bioacoustics. You can put detectors all over the area. So this is a handheld unit. There's a photo here. So you can buy this from a company called Wildlife Acoustics. So we have an Australian company, Titley Scientific. And you buy this device and you can just plug it into your iPad or your phone, and you now have a bat detector. So you can hear the bats, which is pretty phenomenal. This is available to anyone. But you would use a more permanent one, similar to a camera trap. If anyone's seen any of our field ecologists in the field putting out camera traps. And so for my PhD, I'm actually putting 70 of these devices in the field for a week. And this allows me to look at this whole landscape as to where the bats are, and then tease out what actual factors are maybe influencing this level of activity and how this changes through time. And these devices generally are about $1,000 each. But there is a device called an audio moth, which was invented 8 years ago or something, by some PhD students at Oxford University. And these are just about $60 US. So here I am trying to find a bat roost. I know there's a bat in there, but I'm just trying to see where it is. So this is out in Sturt National Park in Cameron's Corner, New South Wales. But this advent of this, low-cost equipment has really opened up to projects all over the world, particularly in the tropics, which is often underfunded. So we are starting to roll these out now on AWC properties for birds and other small mammals as well, but also now starting to do some bat work. And there are projects now to create, you need a reference call library. So you need to catch the bats, record them in that natural search phase state, so you get this real example of how their call looks like, and then you can roll this out into this bioacoustic. So there's a project at the moment to do this for Australia. If you were to use that device that you showed a photo of a second before in North America or Europe, it would actually tell you the species. So we're not quite there in Australia yet, but yeah, just a fascinating field that's really exploding.
So listening out for their calls is the key to unlocking these secrets. And it must be really interesting working in arid Australia, where you wouldn't imagine there'd be a lot of reason for bats to live out there, but you found interesting movements. And I believe there are other researchers out there even thinking about how bats might migrate. Even the small insectivorous bats might migrate through landscapes.
Yeah, so I've already seen, we have a relatively long-term data set from 2018, and through the droughts of 2018, 2019, there were barely any calls at all. So there's really no bats in the landscape at that time. But then if we fast forward to 2021, there's hundreds of bat calls. So they're obviously, not utilizing these areas, and there's a degree of migration. But for these small bats, the southern bent-wing bat is actually known to travel about 70 kilometers between caves in just a few hours. So they are obviously getting around. And Amy Rowles is doing a PhD. So I was recently just doing a tiny bit of work with her in Scotia. And so she is using isotopes from bats all across Australia to really paint a picture of how they are actually getting around across the nation. In particular, the white-striped free-tailed bat, which is one of Australia's largest microbats. And if you ever hear this very high-pitched sort of calling, that is actually them calling. So they call it about 10 kilohertz. So within our hearing. Yeah, so that's what they are. So that's going to be really interesting. And so having a chat with her, yeah, there's definitely these theories that they're actually getting around a lot more. But I'm almost at the stage of doing it, but it's just not quite small enough of getting little GPS units that you can put on these, 7-8 gram bats. And I think that will really be very, very interesting when we can do that.
Yeah, still a lot more to find out. I'd just like to share a little video. I think it's you releasing a bat here during research. So it gives you an idea of how small these animals are.
Just amazing.
Oli, this has been really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information about Australia's incredible diversity of bats. And we wish you luck with your PhD in the arid zone.
Thanks so much, Joe. It's been, really great. And thanks for highlighting bats for Halloween. Yeah, good time to highlight how cool they are.
Yeah, it would be scary if we didn't have bats in our ecosystems. And on that note, all of the work that AWC does is funded through donations. We're a not-for-profit charity. And if you'd like to contribute to work to keep bats in our ecosystems and keep our ecosystems resilient, you can make a donation at australianwildlife.org.